Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm were more than bandmates. They were brothers in every way that mattered. Together, they built the band into one of the most influential groups in rock history. Yet behind the timeless songs and legendary performances lay a bitter feud that tore them apart for decades. In the final chapter of his life, Robertson finally broke the silence, revealing a truth about his relationship with Helm that shocked fans and cast new light on one of music's most painful rivalries: brothers in music. Their story began in the late 1950s and early 1960s, long before the band was a household name. Levon Helm, a Southern drummer from Arkansas, joined Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks as a teenager in 1957. By 1958, he was already playing full-time, setting himself apart with his raw energy and commanding voice. Not long after, a young Canadian guitarist named Robbie Robertson entered the picture. With Rick Danko, Richard Manuel, and Garth Hudson, they formed a tight-knit unit that would soon step away from Hawkins to pursue their own sound. In 1965, their lives changed forever when Bob Dylan asked the Hawks to join him on tour. Dylan's controversial move from acoustic folk to electric rock was met with outrage at the time, but the Hawks, soon to be known simply as the band, provided the firepower and authenticity he needed. Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson stood side by side on stage, facing booing crowds together, bound by the kind of shared struggle that forges unbreakable bonds. By 1968, the band released their debut album, Music from Big Pink, followed by their self-titled masterpiece, The Band. With songs like The Wait and I Shall Be Released, they created music that was timeless, blending rock, folk, and Americana in a way that no one else had done before. Robertson's songwriting and Helm's voice carried the sound into history. At this point, the two men were inseparable. Robbie later admitted that Levon was the closest thing in my life I've ever had to a brother. But as history has shown, even the deepest brotherhoods can fracture under the weight of fame, money, and hurt. Cracks in the brotherhood. By the early 1970s, the band was at the peak of its powers. Their albums Stage Fright and Cahoots carried raw emotion and captured their struggles with fame. Songs like The Shape I'm In and Stage Fright revealed the growing tension between the joy of making music and the pressures of being under the spotlight. For Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm, those pressures began to show in subtle ways. Robbie, as the band's primary songwriter, was increasingly seen as the creative center of the group. His vision pushed them forward, seeking new directions and broader horizons. Levon, deeply rooted in the music of the American South, preferred to hold on to the raw, traditional sounds that had defined them from the start. What began as creative differences slowly hardened into resentment. The real fracture came in 1976, with the farewell concert famously captured in Martin Scorsese's film, The Last Waltz. For Robertson, it was a celebration of their legacy, a chance to end on a triumphant note with friends like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and Joni Mitchell joining them on stage. But for Levon Helm, the film felt like a betrayal. He later argued in his memoir This Wheel's on Fire that Scorsese's documentary centered too much on Robertson, reducing the contributions of the rest of the band. To Helm, it looked as though his so-called brother had abandoned not just him, but the entire spirit of the band. This was the turning point. After The Last Waltz, Robertson stepped away from touring, while Helm continued to perform. Helm's bitterness deepened, especially as financial difficulties and personal struggles weighed on him. The man Robertson once described as the closest thing to a brother now saw him as the source of his frustrations. A rival instead of a friend. Years later, Helm would put his anger into words, openly accusing Robertson of unfairly taking credit and receiving a larger share of the money. What had once been a private fracture now became one of the most talked-about feuds in rock history. And for fans, it was devastating to see two men who had made such beautiful music together turn into bitter enemies. The feud turns public. By the 1990s, the once private conflict between Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm had spilled into the open. For years, Helm had carried his resentment quietly, but in 1993 he released his memoir, This Wheel's on Fire. In it, he wrote with striking honesty about his grievances against Robertson. Helm accused his former bandmate of controlling the band's finances, dominating the spotlight, and unfairly taking the lion's share of songwriting credit. The accusations shocked many fans who had grown up believing the band was a family of equals. Helm claimed that Robertson's decision to stop touring after the last waltz left the rest of the group scrambling for work, burdened by debt and personal troubles. He painted a picture of betrayal, of a brother walking away just when times were hardest. Robertson, for his part, rarely fired back in public. He was deeply wounded by Helm's words, later saying that for all the years they worked together, they had never exchanged a harsh word until after the breakup. To Robertson, the sudden bitterness was almost incomprehensible. He admitted he felt sadness rather than anger, but the damage was done. Helm's book hardened public opinion, framing Robertson as the villain in the story of the band. At the same time, Helm himself was fighting battles far beyond his feud. Financial struggles mounted, and his health began to fail. He would face throat cancer in the late 1990s, leaving him temporarily unable to sing, the very gift that had made his voice so beloved. Robertson later reflected that these hardships fueled Helm's anger toward him because it was easier to focus on old wounds than the cruel hand life had dealt. Yet beneath the bitterness, there was still a sense of unspoken connection. Robertson confessed in interviews that he still loved Levon, still thought of him as family, even if that love was not returned. In a strange way, the feud itself became proof of how deeply intertwined their lives were. For Helm, Robertson was the source of his pain. For Robertson, Helm was the ghost of a brother he could not reach. This uneasy balance, love mixed with resentment, would carry them into the 2000s, when fate would once again bring them face to face in the most tragic of circumstances. One last visit. In April 2012, the world learned that Levon Helm was in the final stages of his battle with cancer. For many fans, the news was heartbreaking, but not entirely unexpected. Helm had been battling throat cancer since the late 1990s, and though he staged a remarkable comeback, performing at his famous Midnight Rambles in Woodstock, New York, the disease eventually returned with a vengeance. Robbie Robertson, long estranged from his former brother-in-arms, knew he had little time left to mend what was broken. He traveled to the hospital to see Helm one last time. Later, in a statement posted to Facebook, Robertson shared his experience. "I sat with Levon for a good while and thought of the incredible and beautiful times we had together," he wrote. "Levon is one of the most extraordinarily talented people I've ever known, and very much like an older brother to me. I am so grateful I got to see him one last time and will miss him and love him forever." The moment was bittersweet. Robertson had carried decades of hurt, but chose to set it aside in that hospital room. At Helm's bedside were his daughter Amy, his former partner and singer Libby Titus, and Libby's husband, Donald Fagen of Steely Dan. Robertson recalled how the family had been kind to him, guiding him through what he called this terrible time of sadness. Just a day earlier, at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Cleveland, Robertson had already sent out love and prayers to Helm while serving as a presenter. To many observers, it seemed that he was making a quiet effort to reconcile, to finally let go of the feud that had overshadowed their legacy. But for all the tenderness of Robertson's words, others close to Helm insisted that the wounds had never fully healed. Friends like radio host Don Imus claimed that even on his deathbed, Levon still held a grudge. Whether or not that is true, the image of Robertson sitting beside him, remembering not the fights, but the music, the laughter, the brotherhood, is one of the most haunting and human chapters in their story. Levon Helm died on April 19, 2012, at the age of 71. For Robertson, the loss was both devastating and complicated. He had said his goodbye, but the shadows of their conflict would linger long after, shut out of the tribute. In the months after Levon Helm's death in April 2012, fans expected that Robbie Robertson would play a central role in honoring his former bandmate. After all, no two figures were more closely linked to the heart of the band than Robertson and Helm. The Grammy Awards tribute seemed like the perfect stage for Robertson to put aside old wounds and stand in the spotlight to celebrate Levon's life. But when the night came, Robertson was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the performance of The Wait, one of the band's most enduring classics, was carried out by Mavis Staples, Zac Brown, T-Bone Burnett, and Mumford & Sons. For many watching, it was a glaring absence. Why wasn't Robbie Robertson there? The answer emerged later from a surprising source. Jonathan Taplin, the band's former tour manager, revealed in a blog post that Robertson had been kept off the stage at the request of Levon's widow, Sandy Helm. According to Taplin, Sandy's decision was rooted in years of bitterness and what he described as a long and sad story of paranoia. Taplin admitted he was angry that Robertson had been shut out, but he praised the performers for delivering a moving tribute nonetheless. This revelation reignited the debate around the Robertson-Helm feud. To some, Sandy's actions were understandable, a widow honoring her husband's resentment to the very end. Levon had spent decades criticizing Robertson, and she may have seen barring him from the Grammy stage as one last act of loyalty. To others, it was tragic. They believed it was a missed chance for Robertson to publicly honor the man he had once called a brother, to show the world that love and respect could outlive anger. Even the 2012 Love for Levon benefit concert, organized to raise funds for Helm's medical bills and celebrate his life, went ahead without Robertson on stage. For fans, this was another painful reminder of the split, that even death could not bring full reconciliation. In interviews that followed, musicians close to Helm, like Larry Campbell, admitted that while they understood why Levon felt the way he did, his reasoning was often beyond logic. Robertson, meanwhile, stayed largely quiet on the matter. To him, the loss was personal, not public. He had said his goodbye at Helm's bedside, and perhaps that was enough. Still, the image of Robbie Robertson, absent from the biggest tributes to his old friend, remains one of the most tragic symbols of their fractured bond. Final reflections and legacy. After Levon Helm's passing, Robbie Robertson carried the weight of their history into his later years. Despite decades of silence and bitterness from Helm's side, Robertson chose to remember their brotherhood rather than their feud. In interviews, he emphasized that for all the years they worked together, they had never exchanged a harsh word until after the band ended. That sudden shift from brotherhood to hostility remained a wound he could never fully understand. In his memoir and later documentaries, Robertson described Helm as the closest thing he had ever had to a brother. He recalled their shared triumphs, the long nights on the road, the joy of creating songs that became part of rock's foundation. Even when recounting Helm's anger toward him, Robertson's tone was not defensive but sorrowful. "I was sad for Levon that he had to go there," he once said, "and I felt terrible for him, but I couldn't fix it." Robertson's own story was filled with revelations. He had grown up believing one man was his father, only to discover later that his biological father was Alexander Klegerman, a Jewish gangster murdered before Robbie was born. That shocking truth shaped his view of identity, family, and ambition. He often spoke of how his relatives on his father's side embraced him with warmth, encouraging his musical dreams even if they didn't fully understand them. In a way, his whole life had been marked by complicated family ties. Brothers who were not really brothers, and brothers in music who later turned into adversaries. On August 9th, 2023, Robbie Robertson died in Los Angeles at the age of 80 after a battle with prostate cancer. He was surrounded by his family, including his second wife Janet Zuccarini and his first wife Dominique, the mother of his children. Martin Scorsese, who had remained a close friend for decades, organized a tribute concert in Los Angeles that November. Among those who gathered to honor Robertson were Joni Mitchell and Leonardo DiCaprio, a reminder of the respect and love he commanded across generations. Even in death, the shadow of his fractured bond with Levon Helm lingered. Fans continued to debate whether Helm had been right in his accusations or whether Robertson had been unfairly vilified. But Robertson himself seemed to want no part of the bitterness anymore. In his final reflections, he chose to focus on the magnificence of the journey they had shared, the groundbreaking music they created, and the love he still felt for the brother who could never forgive him. Their story, like their music, was equal parts harmony and dissonance, a ballad of triumph and tragedy. The bond between Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm was one of rock's greatest stories, a brotherhood that created timeless music, but also one of its saddest feuds. In the end, Robertson's shocking truth was simple. He never stopped loving Levon, even when that love was not returned. What do you think? Should Robertson have been allowed to honor Helm on stage after his death? Or was Sandy Helm right to keep the grudge alive? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from music history.